Within the app. We have no public comment.
Okay, thank you so much. And with that, we'll invite staff presentation.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Snedden and committee members Gutierrez and Jordan. My name is Laura Doubles, and I'm the Housing and Human Services Manager for the city. Thank you for having us here today to present an exciting new fund known as the Housing Opportunities Preservation and Equity, or otherwise known as HOPE Fund for Affordable Housing. To summarize, staff's recommendation is before you today for your review, an ordinance discussion draft to create the HOPE Fund, and then to direct staff to return with a revised ordinance for introduction to council. The goals and objectives of the HOPE Fund are to support a variety of housing-related initiatives, including an expansion of what we already have in our affordable housing funds. We want to encourage local workforce housing and focus on income levels that are or possibly over the low income range. Assist income qualified households up to 200% AMI struggling to afford or maintain housing, and provide assistance to capital projects for affordable housing unit development, housing programs, and our pilot right to council program. In an effort to address the city's current housing crisis, the council initiated the establishment of this new fund on October 4th, 2022. They followed on December 6th with an allocation of approximately $2.88 million for the fund. Staff presented to council this ordinance discussion draft on March 7th, and the council voted unanimously to send this item to the Ordinance Committee today for further discussion, realizing that there was a lot to it, a lot of complexities in establishing this fund. When council voted to send it to Ordinance Committee, they requested a two-part meeting. The first is to go over all of the elements that will be in the draft of this ordinance in a workshop type environment where the public can provide input and pose questions. And then the second meeting is for staff to return with a resulting draft ordinance in order to recommend a version to the full council for introduction. And now I'd like to present to you some background information for just a knowledge and of what's being proposed. On the screen here is a table that is provided by HUD. it contains the income limits and categories for the city of Santa Barbara. HUD releases this on an annual basis with updated figures. And of note, they consider a standard household size to be 4 persons. The median at 100% is listed at $100,100. This is as of April 18th, 2022, and we've been notified that they will be releasing the update May 15th, so this next week. So this will change. However, this table is what all of our affordable housing programs for the city uses in calculating rents and making sure of income qualifications. As you can see, very low income households are at 50%, and the amounts that are listed are maximum amounts. So a household would have to earn under that to be qualified in that category. Low is at 80%, moderate is 120, middle 160, and upper middle is 200%. This table is taken right out of our annual rent survey that we have performed. This actually is median rents as of April of 2022. We are in process of updating this as we speak and should have the new one by the end of this month. This lists median rents for apartments, duplexes, condos, and houses by housing type and also by unit size. Of interesting note, in comparison to the April 2021 rent study, there's been a drastic increase in these rents. So for example, a studio apartment is now listed at $2,000. That is an increase of 20% over the last 2021 figure. For a 2-bedroom apartment, that is a 30% increase. And for houses, that is a 58, pretty much a 60% increase. And on this slide, we also have tables that were taken as well from the rent survey. So what income would this take to actually afford these kind of rents here in Santa Barbara? So for a studio apartment at a median rent of $2,000, an annual income that's needed is $80,000. When you look to the bottom table and you look at the area median income that's listed in the HUD table, it's $70,070. So it requires 114% of that median income to afford that rent. Accordingly, when you look at a 2-bedroom, it's $139,000 for annual income needed. That's 154%. And what's not listed on here, but is of notable mention too, is for a house, a 2-bedroom house rent in Santa Barbara, it would take $180,000 to cover a $4,500 median rent, which is basically 200% of AMI. In March of 2023, the median home price sold in Santa Barbara was $2.1 million. When you take the housing costs for a $2.1 million property to buy, assuming you put a 20% down and you took out a 30-year loan at 6.5% interest, and you add in your property taxes, your insurance, and utilities, all to be deemed as housing costs is what the standard is usually used for, that equates to approximately $13,000 a month. That would be $156,000 a year in housing costs. In ownerships, we do use a 35% income to housing cost ratio for affordability. A household would have to make approximately $37,500 a month to be able to afford a $13,000 a month payment. That's $450,000 a year. That's actually 450% of the area median income in HUD's table. So I'm providing a general example here. A 4-person upper middle income household, which is at that 200% AMI range, the maximum for the household, and that includes all people in the household that may have an income. So if there's a spouse and children, it adjusts accordingly to the size of the household and also the entire household income. So this allows for an affordable payment of $5,839 per month. That's 35% of the housing costs according to their income. $5,839 per month, if you back that up into it, it allows for a total maximum purchase price of approximately $900,000, and that's again assuming a 20% down, a 30-year loan payment at a 6.5% interest rate, plus the property taxes, insurance, and utilities. So we did take a few examples of current Santa Barbara staffing, as well as what the council deemed as what they wanted to really kind of focus on is our emergency responders and what those ranges typically look like. So here on the screen, you can see that there's 4 position titles that we did some research on. A teacher, the average salary range is $56,000 to $99,000. So does this fall into the low income level or 80% AMI and below? I have here as a yes/no because half of the range does fall within that, but half of it falls above, even up into a middle, not only moderate, but middle range. For the other 3 positions, they all do not fall into low income level ranges. The only one that does fall a little bit into a moderate income range is the very beginning of the firefighter range. Approximately $1,500 of that does fall into a moderate income range. After that, it goes all the way up to upper middle. The same happens with police and nurse. However, they do not qualify in moderate. They do qualify for middle and upper middle. So now we'll cover a little bit about the fund and what's eligible as far as funding sources and expenditures. We wanted to establish this new Hope Fund to allow contributions from a variety of funding sources so as to encourage community participation and possibly programs such as maybe employer-sponsored housing where they add to the fund to help with their staff housing needs, or maybe philanthropic donations or contributions. So we provide we want to provide income qualified households assistance to obtain or retain this housing through approved providers. And we also want to provide up to $250,000 that the council set aside for a pilot right to counsel program in order to help save tenants their housing. So for this fund, the money must be used to increase, improve, or maintain the supply of affordable housing. It's also to provide certain approved affordable housing related programs and services. And the best example I can give of that is just recently how we implemented a program with Habitat for Humanity for low-income home repair program. It's to benefit households with maximum incomes of up to 200% AMI and who reside in the city of Santa Barbara. So we're proposing 85% for capital expenditures. That would be for new development of affordable housing units, real property acquisition for future development of affordable housing units, and or rehabilitation of current existing units that may be able to convert into affordable housing units. 15% for programmatic expenses, paid to entities providing approved housing-related programs and services. And in all of this, there will be no supplanting of existing project or program funding allowed. The other eligible expenses is for the $250,000 right to counsel. This is going to be provided to legal aid agencies or reduced rate law firms or staff representing tenants' defense and issues of eviction or forfeiture of housing. We also propose up to 10% of dispersed funding, not of the fund balance, but any funding that is dispersed in a given fiscal year to cover associated staffing costs for administering the fund. As far as the terms we're proposing, capital expenses, for those that are for developing the actual units of affordable housing, we wish to provide those through low-interest amortized loans in order to realize repayments into the fund to be able to recycle funding into new projects. Programmatic expenses provided by grants. Right to counsel is also provided by grants. And administrative expenses would be provided as charges documented to the fund for staff time. I might mention here that a very common mechanism for affordable housing is a residual receipts repayment. We'll go into what that is in a little bit, but those are typically very used in low-income housing, especially with low-income housing tax credits. And the reason for that is because the banks like to see that they don't have another loan to pay until that project actually realizes a positive cash flow. But that may take upwards of over 10 years to realize that. So in that time period, there would be no repayment to the fund in order to recycle the funding. Since the funds are kind of low in this fund, meaning that maybe even one project may take the whole fund, we do want to be cognizant of our options here on repayment. And we really hope to encourage community participation and any matching contributions. So the city will prioritize requests to match private donors' contributions to projects and/or programs. Those matching funds, if they are approved for the project, would be given directly to the project or the program or the approved service provider and not go through the city as a pass-through. However, the city would require receipt of those funds being given in order to disperse our funding. No city funding will be given to an individual, but only to the entities owning the project or agencies providing the approved program or service. So in order to incentivize the affordable workforce housing development for households with incomes between the 120 and 200% AMI range, we are proposing to look at reduced periods of affordability. So for the affordability side of community development, this is a mechanism that we can use. There are other incentives that may be in our planning area, and we are in talks with that, but for now we are looking at the actual affordability periods and proposing a table of reduced periods according to the assistance per unit of subsidy. So the reason for this is so that we actually don't have as much funding going out, yet we can use this mechanism to try to incentivize it. So for developers that are trying to come up with enough capital to afford a development, they would actually be able to recognize a full repayment after their affordability period, which would cover those development costs and a return on investment, which most investors want to see. and be able to spur development of affordable housing units within this range. So this table was taken from a HUD program that was established back in 1990. It's been modified a bit, but that program is the Home Investments Partnership. And the reason that HUD established that program was to encourage public-private partnerships and to spur affordable housing development. And now we're going to go over a few terms that affordable housing land has. As far as land banking, that is actually a mechanism for used by public and nonprofit entities to acquire properties by either sometimes tax default or just plain out purchase of market rate too. But basically storing that property for a period of time so that eventually you can develop affordable housing units. The reason that we don't do that in our affordable housing fund, because the state regulates us to actually, they have a requirement for us to develop those units within 18 months. So we're not able to just store that property. We have to take those steps and do the development on it. It's as a requirement. Capital A, affordable housing, basically just means that every unit in that project is restricted to an affordability covenant. So if you have some market rate units in that project, it is not considered capital A. Capital A only refers to when the entire project has all units restricted to affordability covenants. The Regional Housing Needs Allocation, or RHNA, we've heard a lot about that lately with the housing element. That's actually an allocation given by Santa Barbara County Association of Governments. We're in our 6th cycle right now, and they just gave us our allocation for a period of 8 years, 2023 through 2031. The total allocation is 8,001 units. However, I'd like to just make mention of how that kind of works. So they give us that allocation, and cities are not required to ensure that those units are developed. They are required to basically provide a list of properties that can be used to accomplish that number. For loans, grants, and income qualification, just as it seems, loans are basically given with a repayment requirement. We typically use either amortized loans where there's a payment every month. We establish an interest rate that's a little lower than market rate because we do want to incentivize affordable housing development. We can go up to 30-year terms, and we try to make sure that whatever we write those loans for is able to be given by that project. So we will look at project pro formas for say 20, 25 years or 30 years to make sure that that project can afford that payment. Another mechanism, which again I'll get into a little later, is residual receipts loans, and that's something that we use just primarily in the affordable housing world. Grants are given without repayment terms. However, there is definitely deliverables and measurable outcomes that need to be performed on those. And income qualification, the city, we use HUD's Part 5 or Section 5 of occupancy standards. And so we use that to make sure that the income qualification meets their way of qualifying people, meaning all household income needs to be taken into account. We usually take 2 years of returns, and we are able to subtract out basically things that they say are appropriate too. And so income qualification is huge in making sure that a household qualifies for a income or a affordable restricted unit. For-profit versus nonprofit developer projects. So nonprofit developers usually have, their mission is to provide affordable housing. For-profit is definitely, they have investors that want to see a return on an investment. Nonprofit developers are also eligible if they are doing low-income housing at 80% AMI and below to apply for low-income housing tax credits. So that's one of those mechanisms to incentivize low-income development. For-profit developers usually use either density bonus programs that we offer, or they have mechanisms for trying to find private investors to come on board to supply the capital that's needed for the development. Local worker preference. This is actually something, a term that's been going around a lot, and everybody would love to see this. However, we do need to be cautious when we try to limit a certain population for housing due to our fair housing laws, basically. When establishing a local worker preference, we don't want to unintentionally exclude a certain population. So typically we have to make sure there's a real reason or a nexus built into why we do a local worker preference. 90-year rollover covenants, that's typically used especially in our owner-occupied units when those are basically transferred from one owner to the next. We will put on a whole new 90-year covenant to make sure that that unit stays affordable. We do actually extend our 90-year covenants also on multifamily and rental projects. When we are asked to do a subordination of our loan because of maybe needing, improvements to be done, they need to take a new loan, we will determine if that's going to be okay as far as their pro forma and their financials. We'll look at all of that and make sure, okay, if we're able to subordinate, then we always require either a new 90-year covenant depending on what was already existing, or possibly just an extension of time to make a cumulative 90 years of covenants. Competitive processes, this is very common for any kind of public funding. We usually our requirement is to put out a NOFA, which is a Notice of Funding Availability. We usually put it out for at least 30 days, sometimes more. And in this case, with this fund, it is a process that we would encourage to be placed on it so that we put out a Notice of Funding Availability. And we also let the public know what we are going to be scoring applications for, like what is our, intention of this money, what would we want to see accomplished, and then we give certain points for that. And so at the end of the application period, we usually establish at least a 3-person committee, and that committee will review all applications according to the guidelines and ranking processes, and then those top applicants would be selected for award, but we would be bringing those to the council for final approval on those. Residual receipt loan repayment mechanisms. So this is what we use a lot in the affordable housing world. And what this refers to is we set up a loan according to what that loan can actually pay if, or say when, that project actually has positive cash flow. So we require every year the submittal of all the financials from the agency on that project. And what we do is we go through and we look and say, okay, here's all the revenue, here's all the expenses. What's the actual net positive cash flow on this? And if they do have a positive cash flow, that is typically when we are allowed to have a payment made to the city. So that a lot of times may not occur until, like I was saying, 10 years, 15, 20 years down the road, maybe even not the whole term of the loan at 30 years, and yet the loan is required to be due and payable at the end. So it's not a mechanism that will actually bring in that cash back to the fund for possibly several years into the future. So in summary, Council directed the establishment of this HOPE Fund to address the city's current housing crisis. We feel the HOPE Fund will provide more affordable housing and are very excited about that, and also housing-related programs and services that will assist households with incomes up to 200% AMI in either obtaining or retaining their housing. And I'm here for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Stubbles. I'll start with my colleagues. Councilmember Gutierrez or Councilmember Jordan? Okay, Councilmember Jordan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a whole bunch of questions, unfortunately, so I know we're on the clock. I just want to preface those questions in that I don't think we're doing what council asked staff to do. I don't see this type of setting as being a workshop type setting where I mean, I can see me engaging with you, I can see me engaging with, there's only one side of the aisle in this, I think, and that side of the aisle, but I'm obviously not going to see that side of the aisle engaging with staff in front of council who are certain, well, I'll speak for myself, certainly not the subject matter experts in this. So I'm willing to go through this and ask some questions and maybe even have some comments, but my goal today, one of my goals today will be to continue this to more of a work session type setting at Gebhard with the tables put around together, and I'm sure we'll have suggestions on who should be around that table. So just so that makes sense. I'll go backwards. I think those are more fresher in my mind. The NOFA thing, so for me, that would almost be like an RFP, right? So we'd set the parameters, we'd say whatever that L ends up out of this bucket of stuff here, and then that would come in, and then it would get ranked, rated, tabulated like an RFP or like the funding we do once a year with those other funds kind of thing, and it'd be just a real plain as day type of thing, how somebody rated out and for what reason, right?
Thank you, Chair Sneddon and Committee Member Jordan. Yes, exactly. An RFP is actually when the city is looking for a service provider, basically a contract that they're wanting to do for some work performed, where a NOFA is actually, we have funding available. Now we want to get applications for that, but we're going to set the guidelines just like what we do with the RFPs.
Got it. And then I know we've talked about local worker preference. We've actually talked about local worker requirements. I know there's chatter about types of occupation preference or requirements. So I've been sitting listening to that for a long time. I don't understand why we still need to be cautious. If there's a law, why don't we know when we're on good standing and we can go full steam ahead and pick what we want to do? Either we can't do local workers as a requirement of a program, or we can do a preference. Why can't we get to that point where it's clear and we're not just playing with words?
Chair Sneddon, Councilmember Jordan. So the qualified answer is yes, we can do local preference. However, as Ms. Double said, there are fair housing laws that we have to follow. We cannot establish any fair local preference that would have an unintended impact of further segregating a community or creating a disparate impact. And what that means is that even though we might have what's on its face a neutral local preference policy, if it had the effect of discriminating against a protected class, either by source of income, gender, race, sex, marital class, then we can't do that. If it happened, if someone raised that disparate impact, then we would have to go through the legal analysis and see if there was some sort of overriding condition as to why this local preference was necessary. So the way most cities do it is the broader the local area, so it would generally be the whole city is semi-safe. Even safer is the county. What you can't usually do is limit it by occupation or duration, because
Okay.
then you're looking at privileges and immunities violations because of the right to travel.
So let's use that as an example. Even if you pick the county one as the broad, safe one, you still don't believe you can pick an occupation?
There is certain exceptions for like farm workers,
Okay.
agricultural workers that you can generally give preference to, emergency shelters.
Okay. And anything we would pick in that area is only good enough until it gets challenged and we lose, right? I mean,
Correct.
we're just like everything else. We're just saying something, getting advice, making a decision, and it's only good enough until somebody decides to take us to court.
Correct. And when we're looking at, when you do a local preference, you're looking at, is there a significant legal reason and justification for making this preference? Some examples I was looking up anticipating this is, providing affordable housing and opportunities near places of people's employment to lower VMTs, preventing displacement of local residents, preventing overcrowding or limiting overcrowding in existing units within the city. Those are all things that if council was to direct us to look into local preference, we would look specifically at our community and our city as a whole and figure out why is it that this is really important and necessary for our community.
Yep. Thanks. Then on this discussion that's going to just be forever, I'm sure, on what percentage of AMI, where it starts is 0, I guess, but where it ends on the high end. I don't understand. I mean, I heard you give an explanation, Ms. Doubles, but I just don't understand how we got to this kind of menu system of, depending upon the amount of subsidy, we're going to link affordability to that. Don't we already have controlled rental housing in the city where it's all built the same, but we have a mix of income components within those? So we might have some that are very low, and so you're getting less rent on those from the landlord's perspective, but right in the same complex, looking exactly the same, costs the same to build, costs the same to manage, those might be low or whatever the next one is, and we're getting a different amount, right? So why if, I guess here's the rub for me, why if I'm allowing development that allows for a higher income occupant and a higher amount of rent paid to whoever is the manager or landlord, why would I reduce the years that I want that to be rent controlled as an affordable unit?
Thank you, Chair Sneddon and Committee Member Jordan. Sorry.
Okay.
I understand. I guess where I need to start off is for the affordable housing area. That is our mechanism, but there is other options to, say, tiering those to a different all the way up to 200% AMI.
Right.
And those are very valuable to developers and can be considered. And I know we've had discussions about that as well. That may even be a proposal soon. But as far as the affordability side or affordable housing side, we only have affordability covenants to use in regards to the fund. So what we're going to do is basically whatever subsidy we give, we can reduce that affordability covenant so that the developer can realize the return on the investment for the investor, whoever is going to come up with the big capital for those units, because those units are not usually, or they're not qualified for low-income housing tax credits.
So I kind of get at that, but I don't understand how that answers my question. So if I'm a developer and I'm building a set of units that are all, I'm willing to do them at 200% AMI, I don't believe that's, all of them, I don't believe that's possible. So those developments, if I wanted to build them at a program that was 200% AMI, and I was willing to do a covenant of any amount of years, I believe there still has to be some subsidy to that from somewhere. Nobody's building those now on their own. With
Correct.
The whole thing. So
and that's
so I guess I don't understand, is it just this box we're in that I need to say get out of? Why would we still say that those people only have to do 20 years of affordability in that category? Why would we not say, no, it's still got to be 90, and the math works out to be the math on the amount of subsidy, and either that rates out as a top program selection or it doesn't based on that, right? Why would we preclude those units from also being held in that status as long as a low or a very low or those other categories?
I understand. So the reason for that is because if you say put a 10-year affordability covenant on, after 10 years that is going to come off. Those units will go to market. At that point, though, that is when that return on investment for the investors that originally put the capital in is able to be recognized. So
I guess I'm thinking that that's already happening based on the original subsidy with the Hope Fund, is that the subsidy from the Hope Fund has taken the return on investment math and made it better for the developer in every category up to 200%. It might take more subsidy on our part on a higher AMI than it would on a lower AMI, but then why wouldn't the goal, and so monthly for the lifetime of that project, the developer's getting what they want because we've over-subsidized that set of units versus the very low ones. So why would I allow him to bring those markets back when I've subsidized those units for him up to that point?
right. So for the fund, that's what we're trying to do, is to lower however much subsidy we give,
Okay.
but yet restrict still. So we're going to try to do as little as possible subsidy, honestly, and that's why, $40,000 per unit, and then still restrict them for a certain period of time. So I don't know if that makes sense, but
Yeah,
you're trying to not give as much out of the Hope Fund because
Okay.
it doesn't have as much money.
So you're trying to make the $3 million go further
Right.
than less far?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's an argument I'll remember. I don't know if I buy it yet. Let me just stop. I'm going to just go through these like you and have a question on every page, and let me listen for a little bit. Thank you.
Appreciated, Councilmember Jordan. And I want to say, to your point about, or your question about where was the workshop, I'm considering that there wasn't a workshop, and this doesn't feel like a workshop. So I don't think we should feel rushed to complete this topic today, pat and done. I just want to set that forward. Does Councilmember Gutierrez have any questions at this point?
Yes, thank you, Chair Sneddon. I have a question about slide number 7, please. Oh. I don't know if you can bring that up.
Can you see the slide, Councilmember Gutierrez?
I see myself multiple times like I'm in an 80s music video or something.
The slide is up on the screen if you're,
Okay, well, I have it on my screen too. But I was just wondering where this data came from. I know it's coming from HUD, but like, do you know the process in which it took to get this information?
Thank you, Chair Stanton and Committee Member Gutierrez. That is a great question. HUD does have their own methodology. It is very, very complicated. I could even send you a whole pamphlet on how they do it, but they are the ones that determine this, and we just go by it. That's all I can say. But I'm happy to send over their methodology if you'd like to look at it.
Yes, please. I'd appreciate that.
Sure.
Thank you. And that's all I have for right now.
thank you, Councilmember Gutierrez. I will be brief with my questions at this point, and then we'll hear public comment to be sure that we have a chance for people to come through. So I guess my first question is, when was the workshop? Is this the workshop?
Thank you, Councilmember Sneddon. So this is the first meeting. At our previous meeting, where the item was continued from council, there was a request for 2 or multiple ordinance committee meetings, the first to be in a workshop-like environment. This is that first meeting. I can, based off the comments of you and your colleagues, I can, it's apparent that this is not satisfying that workshop type environment that was expected for this meeting. But this meeting is intended to be the first of multiple meetings where we discuss what was originally presented to council however many weeks ago that was now, and to kick off a series of conversations around where we want to go with the Hope Fund. And so that is why what was presented both in the CAR and today's presentation looked pretty similar to what we saw however many weeks ago that was, because we really felt like the direction we received was to take what was presented then and take that back to ordinance and start there on this conversation of how we want to move forward. I think where we are today and the information that we presented is really putting forward a question. And that question in my mind is this. I'm in meetings every day, every week, where I hear more and more people talking about the challenges in attracting and recruiting talent to their organizations, whether it's our organization here at the City of Santa Barbara or the large employers in our region. And so that need for workforce housing, staff saw this Hope Fund as an opportunity to maybe address that gap that we are seeing, that gap between 120 and 200% AMI earners, those folks in our community that we showed some examples of in our slideshow, the teachers, the firefighters, the police officers that are doing well enough in terms of salary that they don't qualify for housing authority housing, but we're hearing anecdotally that those folks need our help, they need support, they're struggling to continue to live and reside and work in Santa Barbara. And so the question we're putting forward to you today, members of the council, is do you think the Hope Fund is a mechanism to address that sort of missing middle housing? And if you do think the Hope Fund is a good opportunity to make some of those to address some of those needs, then we can put forward some options of how to do that with this fund. If the direction from council is no, we really think that there are members of our community that are extremely rent burdened, extremely vulnerable, and that's where we need to focus our energies and our resources into addressing the needs of those individuals, then we can obviously take that direction and also provide some structure to a fund that is really aimed and focused at addressing that segment of our community as well. And so that's where we are today, and that's why we provided some of the information we provided. I know there was some feedback that we weren't 100% accurate in some of the salary data and things that we provided. We did our best, and we reached out to employers to try to make that as accurate as we could. But really, we don't want the takeaway to be that those are actual salaries or that these numbers are sort of set in stone. It's more about, we just want to bring some awareness that when we talk about workforce housing and the teachers, the firefighters, the police officers, that they are in this sort of in-between position where they don't qualify for a lot of our low-income housing, but they're also struggling to make ends meet and afford housing in a community with an extremely high cost of housing and cost of living. And so that's where we see today's meeting sort of starting us off on that conversation. I'm sorry, I apologize. I'll take the blame for not having us in the right setting or the right environment to really have a very conducive conversation, but that's we'll make sure we do that on the next meeting.
I appreciate that, actually, and the framing of it as a question, and also describing, because that was going to be my next question, is what was the difference between what was at council, which it was really clear to me that we gave direction, and it didn't seem any changed when it came forward, so thank you for explaining that. I'll ask my colleagues, too, when we get there, if we have time. I think that we could make this more workshop by lifting the time limits on public speakers and letting you give your full time of what it is that you want to say. Would feel more like a workshop for today. But I do have questions that I'll save. I have a lot of comments, but I'll save them. So do you have an extra slide? I didn't ask you for this, but for our arena numbers and how we're performing, I have my chart. And as a reminder, and I know I said this at the time, or I can just read it out too, and this was in our March meeting when we had the housing element update, that we had 98% performance for above moderate, which I consider A+, yay, 2% performance for moderate, 12% for very low, and 16% for low, which I consider failing. And I know I made that comment, and I want to just get confirmation for how we're performing, or if there's a slide on how we're performing in the different categories for arena.
So I believe we have that information and can bring it up. I would just like, before we get into the numbers, I would like to highlight, though, that the above moderate category, again, includes our market rate housing. And so that number, that performance in that category doesn't easily describe the sort of situation that I referenced in my previous comments about this gap that we have. And so we do have a gap. I think we can pull the numbers, but I think we all are also aware of it sort of anecdotally, that this gap between sort of market rate and 120% AMI, that we're seeing very little housing production in that category, but it's sort of hard to identify that from this table because that above moderate also includes all of our market rate development.
So then maybe we could go to slide 9 and slide 12. And I have questions on those, and then we'll get to public comment. I have just a couple more questions, but.
I think you just type in the number.
So slide 9. So, and it's the same question for both slide 9. Actually, we can go to slide 12. So that yes/no category of does this fall into 80% AMI or below, my question is if we change that to do they fall below 160% AMI, yes or no? I'm seeing that those would all be yes. Like why the 80? Why did we choose 80% instead of the numbers we're actually considering?
So on each of those, some of the range would fall into 160 and below, but some of them would be up into upper middle.
My question is, the category says 80% AMI or below. Could you tell me the yes or no for if we said 160%, which is what I think many of us were proposing? So I'd like to know the yes or no for that category.
So I've put here on the screen the HUD income limits table again, and looking at the 160%, if we go back to, if we're looking at just a one-person household, that upper range, the maximum of 160 is 112, 112. So if we go back to this slide, the 112 would be within kind of the middle of those ranges. So the lower part of those ranges would qualify in that range, but the upper part of those ranges would not.
Okay, so I would interpret that as that all of those could be a yes if we made it 160% or below AMI. They're captured within that. It doesn't need to go up to 200% to capture teachers, nurses, police, and firefighters, is how I'm reading that.
I think there are salaries in these sort of example positions that we're looking at that do fall within 160.
160, okay, because that's the number I'm holding on to, is 160. So I just wanted to confirm that. And then I think also direction, this is maybe to the workshop question, but I think there was direction to sit down with the Housing Authority and on this topic, and has that happened, and what's the outcome of that?
Yes, thank you for that question, Council Member Sneddon. We have had multiple meetings with the Housing Authority. Both Ms. Doubles and myself have met with them multiple times since the last hearing. I think those meetings have been extremely productive, and I think those meetings led to some of the ideas that were included in the Housing Authority letter. We received that letter yesterday as well, and we, as staff, thought that those, the sort of ideas contained within that letter reflected sort of outcomes of those meetings we had between staff and the Housing Authority.
Okay.
And we were not surprised to see a lot of the things that were contained within that letter.
Great, thank you. And then they're not reflected in the staff report, because the staff report is largely what the staff report was before. So do we understand? So it's not incorporated?
Correct.
those-
And that staff report was written and uploaded prior to staff receiving the letter from the Housing Authority. So, and again, just to explain why the thought process behind what was shared for today's meeting was really with the intention of bringing forward what was brought forward previously back as a starting point for us to then launch into this conversation about where council would like to go with the Hope Fund. And so
Thank you.
That was our expectation as well.
I understand that now. Thank you. So with that, I think with committee latitude, do we want to allow a little extra time for public speakers in the spirit of workshop, or do you want to save formal workshop for a different time? Or you're okay? All right. So let's go ahead and have our public comment. If you feel that you would need more time than the 3 minutes allotted, please say so. And we want to make sure that shorter speakers have a chance to definitely get in today, and we want to hear from all of you. So,
Chair Sneddon,
yes.
for purposes of Brown Act and equality, can we set a ceiling so that,
Okay. Let's make a ceiling of 10 minutes. Okay, thank you. So we'll start with public comment.
Okay. We'll have the public commenters that are in chambers, and then we'll go to the ones that are online. So first up will be Rob Fredericks.
Good afternoon, Chair Sneddon, Councilmember Jordan, and Councilmember Gutierrez. Just want to say at the outset, we were a little bit hampered in timing of getting our letter in because we were only able to see what city staff was going to come up with when it was published on Thursday. Would have loved to have seen it earlier. Just so you all know that, and you all know this, Santa Barbara, like many communities, is in the midst of a severe housing shortage, as is evidenced by the new regional housing needs allocation numbers for the city that was just shown on the screen. And our failure to invest in the fundamental need for affordable housing has undermined and will continue to undermine our other investments throughout all community sectors. While some have stable housing in the community, the lack of supply for our fellow community members impacts us all. And we at the Housing Authority posit that it is the lowest income households who are the most burdened due to the high cost of housing. Given this, we should focus the use of the limited funds where they are needed the most. The RENA, census, and other data shows that the needs and cost burdens are undeniably the most severe at moderate and low income levels. Our analysis provided in our letter indicates that for the most part, households earning above 160% of area median income can indeed afford current market rents. So expanding the use of the funds above this income level would essentially be a gift of government funds if allocated to areas where they are not truly needed. And from what I heard at the last City Council meeting concerning the HOPE funds, Council gave clear direction as to having the vast majority of these funds go toward investing in permanent affordable housing. So it would be our recommendation that 90% of the funds be used for this purpose and 10% be used for services to assist residents in obtaining and retaining their affordable homes. Under our 90% allocation for capital, we provided our guidelines in the front part of our letter, and that is it should be used for new construction of affordable housing for very low, moderate income, middle income households, serving households up to 160% AMI, because above that, you can afford market rents. Conversion of residential or commercial to affordable housing for very low, moderate income, and middle income households up to 160%. Land banking is very important for agencies like the Housing Authority, where we're looking for opportunities that are coming our way, and yet we need to quickly get these funds to land bank while we go through the entitlement process for a new development. At the last hearing, Mr. Szymanski mentioned a possibility of obtaining a piece of land where we could build up to 60 units. We lost that chance, but now it's coming back to us again. So if we had these funds available, we could purchase that property and then build 60 units for affordable low-income households. Workforce housing, it should be available to those who a workforce preference, local workforce or living locally. The Housing Authority has a very good track record at our local preferences. Ours is South Coast wide because that's really one housing rental market that we have, and that helps us avoid the disparate impact that Ms. Ostrander mentioned. All affordable units under this program must be documented by a recorded affordability covenant with a term of 90 years as per the affordable housing funding sources. All funding disbursements and deposits should be followed by what is currently the practice going through Finance Committee and then City Council. We don't agree with the NOFA process because, again, that'll take time, right? We have to wait for a NOFA to be issued and then putting in an application, being reviewed. By that time, we've lost an opportunity to purchase a piece of land for affordable housing. And it's just not for nonprofit developers. A for-profit developer could make use of this system as well, and that's been done in the city, even using residual receipts loans. I can think of El Patio Gardens up off of Villa Lucero. That was done by a for-profit developer. Presidio Parks Apartments behind our development, behind our offices, was also a for-profit developer. Also, any funds dispersed should be a loan, in our opinion, not a grant. That way, those funds can be recirculated in the future, but those loans should not be amortized. They should be simple, straight interest loans, residual receipts, so that when the property can afford to make repayments on the loan, they can. And we're currently paying back the city about $700,000 a year off of residual receipts loans. So you do have that recirculation occurring already from old RDA loans. We also believe it's very important for semi-annual reviews of the Community Development Department for submitting a report to council detailing how those HOPE funds are used and distributed. We don't believe a match funding program should be allowed due to complexity and lack of transparency. So, keeping this criteria that I just went over with you simple and clear, and following the existing affordable housing policies and procedures handbook will help keep the process efficient and effective. In other words, allocate the funds as to what is currently allowed and proven to work. Then there is no need to create all these new programs and take more time and then have to have more admin fees to run all these new programs. Currently, the city takes about $850,000 a year from the successor agency Affordable Housing Fund for staffing costs. More should not be needed out of that fund or out of any other affordable housing fund. Although we did meet with Mr. Isaacson and his staff over the last few weeks with productive and collegial conversations, we continue to have a lack of consensus, as you know from our letter and my comments here. And we believe the most efficient and effective use of the funds should be under the current adopted affordable housing policies and procedures handbook that have been crafted carefully over many years and have been proven to work. And we cannot emphasize enough the need to serve those at lower income levels. The RENA allocations show the unmet need is clearly at the moderate to low income households. I am sure my colleagues at the city understand this need. Additionally, it is important to note in our letter, with the data we provided, 55.6% of the full-time city employees are paid at moderate income and below. And so that is exactly where the true need is. Also, when it comes to homelessness, it's important to note that homelessness is indeed a housing problem, not because everything else is irrelevant, but because housing creates a dignified space where anything else can become relevant. Affordable housing is foundational toward building a healthy, vibrant community. And although we've explained a lot in our letter and here today, if you remember that we are essentially requesting the use of these funds follow the existing policy as adopted under the Affordable Housing Policies and Procedures Handbook, with one minor exception, that's increasing the household income limit from 120% AMI to 160% AMI. Problem solved. You have a program. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Fredericks. Next public speaker.
Frank Rodriguez.
Good afternoon, Chair Sneddon and Council Members Jordan and Gutierrez. Really appreciate this conversation. This is the type of conversations we want to be having, these visions. Totally agree with the letter that was submitted from the Santa Barbara Housing Authority and the thoughtful letter from the League of Women Voters. For us as CAUSE, as y'all know, we really work a lot with domestic workers and service workers, and we really want to make sure that we have housing, envisioning housing for them here in Santa Barbara and into the future. We're excited for the continued conversations in workshop mode, and we'll definitely give more input then. But definitely wanted to keep it short and focus on a few pieces. One, this should focus on low income and build up into moderate and up to 160. Right now, we don't have all the funds in the world. We already got told that this might be available just to help with one project. So because we have limited funds, really focus on low income, and in the future, as we continue to build and increase the funds that are within this HOPE program, then we start thinking about the higher thresholds. We're really excited to thinking about the the most affordable housing stock we currently have, and that's the housing stock that's currently in the market. So really excited to see what can happen with rehabilitation. How do we make sure that the older housing stock that we have throughout the city gets used to really create what we totally agree with, which is the next point, is creating permanent affordable housing. We feel that should be the goal. And we do agree that this should be done by not-for-profit organizations because in the long term, we want this to stay permanent affordable housing. The last thing, really appreciate the conversation on right to counsel. As you know, we feel that the equation to have development without displacement in our community is to make sure tenants have protections. Of course, we support a broad range of protections, but we appreciate the step to implement the right to counsel to make sure that tenants have the ability to have a lawyer present in civil court. And yeah, I'll keep it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Stanley Sankoff.
Hello, Chair Snedden and Council Members Gutierrez and Jordan, and everybody joining us today, and thanks for all your hard work on staff as well. I'm here as a member of the Santa Barbara Tenants Union and as a working class renter myself. And in short, I'd just like to echo the calls to ensure that the Hope Fund prioritize building and preserving truly permanent and truly affordable housing for those who need it most. And so toward this, I believe, like others you've heard from today, want to uplift the letter from the Housing Authority, from the League of Women Voters, from CAUSE and others, that the fund should only be available to nonprofit and City of Santa Barbara Housing Authority. As was mentioned, there are already plenty of incentives for-profit developers, and I really think we should invest in some of the not-for-profit developers. New housing construction and preservation projects should be limited to those who need it most. I'm not exactly sure on exactly what percentage of AMI that is, but it does seem like 200,000 is really high. I mean, the people that I interact with who are desperately in need of housing and who are packing in tighter, commuting farther, making difficult decisions in their day-to-day budgets, are not making the $140,000 for a single-family household. And I'd like to just echo the sentiment that, I understand that there's a balance as that was mentioned in the staff discussion about balancing how long we keep things under an affordability covenant and how much incentives we distribute to how many developments. And I do hope that we really prioritize keeping those units affordable as long as possible. But I can imagine that's a delicate balance. And I just also wanted to give you all a shout out for really having the conversation about building new units to meet our housing needs alongside the conversation around making sure that tenants can stay in our homes. I sound like a broken record by now, but when when a tenant gets displaced, it's tragic, not just for that individual and they're a bit of the social fabric of our community, but also, it contributes significantly to the loss of remotely affordable housing stock in our region. And that's why I'm really pleased that part of this initiative includes right to counsel, and I look forward to discussing some of the details around what the best practices are in administering that kind of program. And alongside this, I'd like to echo calls for increasing this funding stream for affordable housing and passing policies like rent stabilization and a right to re-rent, which are also important pieces of this puzzle that we're solving together to preserve and build housing that's truly affordable without displacement. And I just also want to appreciate the care with which each of you are taking to make sure that we actually delve into this with the care that it deserves. This is a really huge opportunity for all of us as a community, and I wasn't prepared to give more input today on some of the specifics, but I'm looking forward to some of the community conversations that we'd have, and I'd love to make sure that tenants who I see on the daily are included in that, and happy to facilitate that wherever it's appropriate. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And our next public speaker.
Diane Black.
My clock already started. Chair Sneddon and members of the committee, my name is Diane Black, and I'm speaking on behalf of the League of Women Voters of Santa Barbara. Our comments are based upon the report released last Thursday. It's unfortunate that changes and details were presented today that the public and we were unable to really comment on it and thoughtfully consider. And we do look forward to a true workshop in the future. I appreciate your community development director's summary of the potential use of these funds. On the one hand, to help those most in need of support in our community, or to attract above moderate income workers to the community. The draft ordinance assumes the latter is the more worthy goal. The League strongly believes that the primary purpose of the HOPE Fund should be to build and preserve permanent affordable housing. These funds should be focused on where the need is greatest, the needs, inequity, and cost burden are the greatest, which is indisputably housing in the very low to moderate income ranges. We also strongly believe that these funds should only be allocated to nonprofits and the City of Santa Barbara Housing Authority, that they should be for new housing construction or preservation projects that are 100% income restricted at the very low to moderate income level, for projects with an affordability covenant of 90 years, and for projects that have a local preference for city residents and/or people who are employed in the city. We do not support disbursement of funds, which are public dollars, to for-profit developers under any circumstance. For-profit developers have other state and local programs available to them. You've heard them, the state and local bonus density program, AUD, SB 330, which provide financial incentives to build middle and upper middle income housing. These include streamlined approvals, higher density, and lowered parking and open space requirements. Further, the city could amend the AUD and local bonus density programs to further incentivize the development of middle and upper middle income housing. That's the way I think you should provide for those types of housings. And developers can partner with nonprofit organizations or the Housing Authority who can apply for these funds. While there is no question that we need additional housing in the middle and upper middle income levels, precious public dollars should not be spent on projects that provide housing at 200% of the area median income. They should be spent, again, where the needs are the greatest, and the data clearly shows that the need is greatest at lower income levels. For the next RENA cycle, 62% of the city's housing need falls within the very low to moderate income level. Low-income renters are the most significantly cost-burdened, with 79% of all low-income renters spending more than 30%, and many substantially more than 30% of their income on rent, while only 24% of moderate and above moderate income renters are cost-burdened. This income level also has the fewest housing options available to them, as we outlined in our letter. The affordability covenant of 90 years is essential to ensure the HOPE funds make a meaningful and lasting contribution to meeting our affordable housing needs. To accept anything less is a waste of public funds. The allocation process for these funds is also important. We believe it should occur through a public, transparent process. I don't know what that process should be, but it definitely should be public and transparent. We don't support using these funds for administrative costs. If the entire amount of the fund were allocated in 1 year, that would be $250,000 of administrative costs. That's a pretty highly paid position at the city working full-time for a year. We look forward to seeing our points incorporated into the ordinance, and of course we will participate in any public workshops that come. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next speaker.
Ellen Bilston.
Thank you, Chair Sneddon, Councilmember Jordan, and Gutierrez. Thank you for the opportunity to speak this afternoon. This is something new to me. I really hadn't been following it very closely and learned a lot from staff's presentation this afternoon. It sounds like a very interesting, sort of creative problem-solving approach to the affordability of building housing in this community, which has been a problem for a very long time. I'm still catching up on the full understanding of the program, whether this is fully public funding or if this is more along the lines of an investment opportunity for members of the community who are concerned about the difficulty of getting housing built in the community. I'll look into it further, but in the meantime, I'll just advocate for the idea that perhaps if it were seen more as a way for people with the means in the community who have their housing needs met already could perhaps participate and turn $250,000 of funding into something far more significant and meaningful in terms of addressing the problem. As Ms. Doubles said earlier, maybe this would help one project forward at this dollar level. And knowing the cost of construction in this community, I think that's probably about right. This seems like something, if it's really a good idea, should become something far greater than what we're talking about here today in terms of dollar level, so that it can actually address the goal of getting housing built in our community, which in my mind is what the real goal should be, regardless of income level. As we saw, the RENA numbers demonstrate that some areas of income level have been addressed reasonably well in the past. Hopefully with the next round of the housing element, we'll see a lot more of that occurring. But in the meantime, whichever developers, be they nonprofit or for-profit, who are inclined to get housing built, I would see that as an appropriate allocation of the funds, particularly if the source of the money is coming from local people who are looking for an investment opportunity, and not that this would be drawing from city funds in any way. It also, I mean, as an architect in town, occurs to me that, a lot of the cost of getting housing built is tied up in the permit process challenges that we've been experiencing for a long period of time. A lot of things addressed in the Novak report and improvements that I know city staff is working on making, but those sorts of improvements can vastly improve the affordability of getting housing built. Thank you.
Okay, we'll go to our speakers online. We have 3 who have their hands raised. Our first speaker will be Gabe Escobedo. Gabe Escobedo, can you hear us?
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Sneddon, Councilmember Jordan, and Councilmember Gutierrez. My name is Gabe Escobedo, and I'm here to speak on my own behalf as a resident and not in association with any other organizations. I just want to applaud staff and you as a city council for creating the Hope Fund. It's an exciting program coming from the housing element, but I wanted to voice my concerns about the details outlined in the staff report. As one of 2 planning commissioners that worked with staff on early versions of the housing element, I remember the intent of the Hope Fund as a housing element program, and it was to support the development and preservation of deed-restricted affordable units. The idea is that this would be a fund similar to what previously existed through the Redevelopment Agency, but with a local funding source. The Hope Fund should strictly fund 100% deed-restricted projects up to 160% AMI. Most projects we see in the city are market rate and are outside the reach of our teachers and many of our first responders. In addition to thinking about those that work in our city, we also need to think about those with the greatest needs, and the greatest needs are in the low and very low income categories of RENA. We have an ever-growing number of folks working full-time jobs and multiple jobs that cannot pay these rents. In fact, we have more than 1,000 kids that are in our school district that are homeless. Yes, we need housing at all income levels, but this fund will be limited in its amount, and we need to focus it where it can do the most good for those who need it most. I agree with Mr. Isaacson that there is a nexus between recruitment and housing, but I do not buy the argument that we need to use public dollars to focus on housing between 160 to 200% AMI. That income range does not meet the need for many organizations, including education, nonprofits, hospitality, etc. The salary chart in the presentation is a little misleading because it shows us a range, but there is not an even distribution of salaries amongst that range, and oftentimes the distribution is skewed closer to the lower range. We should not overcomplicate this process and follow our current affordable housing policies and procedures, which are based on the days where we had the redevelopment agency. The Housing Authority is a trusted partner in our community, and I ask that you incorporate their reasonable and pragmatic recommendations that are based on data and effective practices. Please support the Housing Authority's recommendations outlined in their letter. And I look forward to being at the next Ordinance Committee meeting to review the HOPE Fund policies. Thank you for your time. Thank you to staff, and thank you for everyone who's been involved in this process up until now.
Our next speaker is Nadia Ashanab. Nadia.
Good afternoon, council members. My name is Nadia Abushanab. I'm here on behalf of SBCAN, the Santa Barbara County Action Network. And I'd just like to echo everything that's been said from our partners at the Housing Authority and the League of Women Voters, and also uplift an email that was sent to you by Dick Flax yesterday outlining SBCAN's position. But yeah, we support what was written in the Housing Authority letter and the League of Women Voters letter, that the HOPE Fund should be used to provide funds for nonprofits and the Housing Authority for the new construction or preservation of projects that are intended to support the low and very low income level community members, and keep the affordability covenant at 90 years, and also pursue a local preference policy. And yeah, I appreciate staff's work on this so far, and your support as council members for this effort, and I look forward to being a part of additional discussions. Thank you.
Our final speaker is Linda Honigman. Linda Honigman.
Good afternoon, Ordinance Committee. I'm Linda Honigman, a South Coast resident who is concerned about the loss of our city workers and young families and the stress of being experienced by city renters. I also want to share that the link for making online comments via Zoom was not clickable from the agenda PDF, so that took a while to find. I am disappointed that the previous comments by community members in March, which were nearly unanimous, haven't been addressed in this current draft. I would like to echo the many important points shared in the letters from the League of Women Voters of Santa Barbara and Rob Fredericks from the city's Housing Authority. One of the original purposes, I thought, when the fund was first discussed in the fall, was to replace what was lost when the state closed the redevelopment agencies. The Housing Authority has not had funds to leverage state or federal funding since that time, which has made it even harder to respond to the urgent needs. It is very important to use the HOPE Fund for permanently affordable deed-restricted housing for very low to moderate incomes. We also need to make sure that local residents and workers are prioritized. I'm all for employer housing, but this fund that we hope will attract donations from philanthropists, nonprofits, and foundations need to utilize the nonprofit developers and the City of Santa Barbara Housing Authority who specialize in the very low to moderate income groups. The administration should be a thorough, transparent process. ideally involving the Finance Committee with full council approval of awards. And we should not be taking funds out for 10% administrative costs. The term for affordability should be 90 years for all units funded by HOPE. And the current plan seems to be focusing on what private developers can pencil out more easily as opposed to what is needed the most by the city's residents and workers. Finally, I agree with Rob Fredericks that loans are better than grants in order to maximize the reach of the fund. Thank you, and excuse my roofers.
Chair Sneddon, no further speakers.
Thank you so much. And it is to the committee and Councilmember Jordan.
I'll make some suggestions, and then if it seems to have some traction, I'll be happy to make a motion. But I'd like the next effort to be something like a Gebhard with the tables all pushed together with everybody sitting around and, just 5 boys in our family. So I'll just say, really what I want to see is you make an argument, they make an argument, we listen to both sides of the argument and then figure out what really makes sense. But that's more than this type of structure where I don't really know what your feelings are on what you've heard, and they don't really know your feelings on what the back and forth should be. So that's the kind of thing I hear. I'm really frustrated with comments that come in comments in here and then comments that come in by email, and they only come in since Thursday because that's the first time you saw your thing. So part of my suggestion for that would be that we set a deadline for public comment that could be addressed that comes in, so something like 2 or 3 weeks in advance. So this is kind of our starting point today. Everybody's kind of seen their thing. I would suspect some people have their talking points all ready to go. And the 2 or 3 weeks would then give staff an opportunity to put together a response matrix, like an EIR, a simple little thing, right? You can pummel me later, but you know what I mean. So it's like, here's a point, 90 years tied up in affordability covenant. You have some other ideas. That's the point made. What's the argument against that, and what are the points that specifically address that? Because I think there's probably, I maybe have a list of 10 issues that I have no idea how to go which direction or the other. And I think that's the starting point like that. And then we put us all together and rummage through that. So I know you'll watch this again, so let me just tell you what I think my points are, and then people that don't think I'm picking up on some of their points can make sure they talk about that. But definitely the AMI percent range, where's the high point, and what's the pros and the cons for that. The length of the covenant restriction. It's 90 years for everything, something else for something else. And I have opinions on all these, but I'm just going to leave them out. But preferences, choices that can be legally supported, and what those actually look like, what they look like, who they're for, what they're at, and that somebody's vetted those legally. Handling the process through approval at the community development level versus at the council level, and what are the pros and cons for that. Loans versus grants, although I will sneak in a comment. I am 100% more on the side of loans, except for the right to counsel program. Those should be grants, so I'll just maybe save you some angst on that. The admin costs, the comments on the admin costs, eating up money to go to actually building units, and what are the choices there and how we get around that. And some specific, get out of the chart and talk specifically about some homeless transition house options with this money too, whether it's appropriate, not appropriate. They're certainly on the chart at 0 maybe, or whatever, $1,000 a month on some Social Security or something. But I think they're a forgotten category because we just look at this HUD thing. And then, just to throw the grenade out there, how we avoid having our good deed hijacked by design review processes. So this happens every day now for programs we already have. Floors get lopped off, and both units that will eventually be affordable and units that are inclusionary are lost in that process. So how do we manage that? What's a way to get out in front of that, that kind of thing. One other suggestion, so my suggestion on workshop would be it's the Ordinance Committee, it's whoever staff wants, maybe a couple people from Housing Authority. I'm loving it today because John Campanella is sitting in the audience, former planning commissioner who usually has a calculator on a chain around his neck. And that would also be a suggestion of mine as to somebody who is at the table that's really conversant, that is not part of an organization and doesn't have that not a bias, just doesn't have that attachment to an organization and can speak both sides of a story. So that would be my suggestion, Madam Chair.
May I ask a quick question, Chair Snedden? Councilmember Jordan, on the last point you made about design review and things like that, would it be acceptable to you and other members of the Ordinance Committee if we came with some ideas of where else we could address some questions like that, where if it wasn't necessarily embedded within the language of the Hope Fund, where else may be appropriate to deal with that? And
like
where
a
else
new
we may already
category,
be
community benefit, that rises to the level of getting in front of council early, getting approved, and then sent along. I mean, you're thinking of the same, it doesn't have to be hope-ish, but it has to be, but the recognition that there is a problem there, the hope thing does the good deed, and then it just goes sideways somewhere else, right? Yep.
Thank you.
Councilmember Gutierrez, do you have comments?
No, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I have some comments too, and then a question, and then maybe we can discuss how to move forward. So there was the idea of the workshop, and then the workshop didn't happen, and here we are. And I understand now the intent, but we've twice now had full comment letter from Housing Authority, from League of Women Voters, from tenant protection groups, from residents, and I felt strongly at the time, and I think gave the direction at the time, and I feel strongly now that all of the points here are well taken from the Housing Authority letter. So I would reiterate that if we do have a workshop, if we're not prepared to make recommendations today, I think these absolutely have to be included as part of the report, part of the conversation, and equal, at least equal. I mean, I'd be prepared to say I'm prepared to go with all of these bullet points as I was the first time it came. So it's consistent. There's just more information here to back that up. So I'll be detailed about what it is so that we can keep the record going of what at least some of us can consistently think is important. Well, first of all, it's really exciting that we have this Hope Fund. I don't want to lose that. And it's pretty clear to me that the spirit of that momentum was to address affordable housing, and that should be used for affordable housing. It's been mentioned before, we're in a crisis, and we've talked about it in different ways, and just to stop the bleeding at the most vulnerable levels. The increases that you showed in the different categories of what was a 30% increase and 100% increase, that just makes it more clear than ever that at the lower income levels, much more impacted. We've heard that description of sort of a exponential impact of rent burden, overcrowding, work housing imbalance, the lower we are on that chart with income levels. So, if you're making $200,000 and much of that is going to rent, well, much of that is still available for food, for cars, for entertainment, for other options, medical care. So that same percentage of a very little, almost nothing number leaves really, truly nothing left to live on. So it's really clear to me that the maximum would be 160%. In the League of Women Voters comments, they said up to 120%. That could go to 160% with Council and Finance Committee approval. I think that's a nice flexibility. But anything above 160% to me is really sort of missing the spirit of giving hope, like quite literally, to those who cannot make it. Not for those who it's hard to make it, those who it's harder to find, but those who just cannot make it without the extra funding. So I feel very firm on that, that all of these considerations need to be limited to 160 or below AMI. So that's for new construction of affordable housing, up to 160 AMI. I think the idea of land banking, that's come up twice now, I find that compelling. I think that really could be a multiplier in terms of how many units you could get for a smaller, you're not building the construction and all those other costs, but for the land, and I think that's, the cost of land here is so high. So having that be included, the workforce housing, income restricted for households employed within the city limits. If I'm correct, then having that for the South Coast or countywide makes it not so questionable, and I think that that's a really good idea, and also in the spirit of this Affordable Housing Trust. These last bullet points of being documented and recorded by the covenant of 90 years, I really do not understand why it would be less than 90 years. I know we've talked about it, and I understand the words and the concept, but I guess I would say I don't quite agree that that's where the most needed impact would be. And then I think a loan is a good idea. There may be some places where a grant is desirable, and I guess that could go through finance or council for approval. If it was going to be a grant, I can think of some instances where that might be. In 1 second, and then coming back through community development, council, transparency, almost anywhere in here where it says the authority of community development director or city administrator, I'm not in favor of, just because it depends on who that person is. And I like things to be like this, transparent and full of discussion. So I would support all of these points at this point without further workshop. But I see this as a workshop, but also we can workshop. And Mr. Lassen, if you wanted to comment on that.
Yes, and thank you, Chair Sneddon. It's very clear the direction that's being provided this afternoon, and so I think in terms of the next meeting, I think we will be doing a much better job of setting us up for the type of discussion that's expected, as well as much better aligned to both of your expectations as to where the starting point of that conversation is. It wasn't our intention to ignore any comments that were received prior. It was a misunderstanding on my part of the direction that was given as to where the starting point for today's conversation was to be, and I understood it to be where we left off, as staff not really being able to make any comments or anything at the last meeting. And so we were just going to pick up from there and move forward, and that's what we did. But I understand there was a different expectation. We will be sure to do a better job of meeting that expectation moving forward. Just on one point of clarity on the grants versus loans, I don't think we've had an opportunity to really talk about that in detail. I believe, and Ms. Doubles, correct me if I'm wrong, but the idea there was that any large capital expense would obviously be a loan, similar to how we do things now. The grants would come into play on small dollar assistance on the programmatic side. So we saw the 90-10 split that was proposed by the Housing Authority in their letter. I think we were suggesting somewhere around 85-15 split. If it's the pleasure of the council, that'd be 90 and 10. I think that's very much aligned with our thoughts and thinking on the sort of proportionality of where things are going with the Hope Fund. But on that 10% side, in the area of small dollar assistance to individuals through agency participation, whether it be to make first and last or to keep people housed in the housing that they currently are in, we could see a scenario where those disbursements might be in the form of a grant versus in the form of a loan. And the reason for that also being just the administrative overhead of tracking those funds. And if it is a small dollar amount, it may be in the best interest of the city not to require repayment just because of the staffing time associated with those funds. So that was the thinking there. I don't think we've really explained that explicitly in any of our presentations, so I just thought I'd share that for clarity.
Very appreciated. Thank you. And to be fair, we haven't done something like this before with workshops or asking for these things. So as we're all working this out. So I was really happy that you explained that and then understood. Yeah, so thank you. I'd want to make sure that I say, too, that I'm supportive of these funds only going to nonprofit or housing authority, being 100% affordable and deed restricted. And again, in this spirit of workshop, then I realize that what often happens is we make decisions here and then we speak with you independently and hear an explanation of why that's a good idea or not, but I think the workshop would address that, making the transparently the case and understanding those. So at the risk of having a misunderstanding about what our next steps are, yeah.
So, Eli, so just so I don't have to put it in the motion, could we just count on you maybe just to reach out to all who have engaged or sent in an email so far and just maybe give them a heads up, say you got a couple weeks. If you need to refine your points or address anything you heard today, get it in so staff can include that as part of the report. And we just, I just make the motion to continue this meeting to a workshop style as we have, as we've talked about when available. Does that work for you?
Chair Sneddon and Councilmember Jordan, we are happy to extend the invitation for participation in that to those who have participated thus far. And if there's, if there's anyone else that you think of that you think would be vital to furthering that conversation, please let me know. We'll make sure they're aware of it as well.
Okay, so then I'll move that we continue today's meeting to a workshop style subsequent meeting to be determined on a date by staff.
And if we could add that the starting point incorporate some of the comments from the previous two
Yes,
meetings.
that was kind of like my EIR example in Matrix, but yeah. Yep. Does that make sense, Nicole? Okay.
I second.
And if we could have a roll call vote.
Moved by Councilmember Jordan, second by Councilmember Gutierrez, that the Ordinance Committee directs staff to schedule a workshop to include all that should be engaged and with the discussion points brought up by the committee. There's a whole list. I don't know if you want me to read those out or.
Well, it's
Councilmember
Councilmember Jordan's motion, but my points were as reflected in the letters from Housing Authority and League of Women Voters, but I don't know if that's.
Works for me.
Okay, we'll just take that as the motion then.
Yep.
All right. We'll do a vote, and I'm going to have Talia go up and vote for Councilmember Jordan. Or, I'm sorry, Councilmember Gutierrez. Councilmember Gutierrez?
Yes.
Councilmember Jordan?
Yes.
Chair Sneddon?
Yes. And with that, we are adjourned. Thank you so much.